In June 1941, Nazi Germany suddenly launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive military offensive against Soviet territory. The brutal campaign quickly pushed the Red Army into a critical situation, with casualties mounting at an alarming rate. In the face of this crisis, traditional gender boundaries began to blur. Women were increasingly sent to the front lines, not just in support roles but as armed combatants actively engaged in battle. As German forces continued to push deeper into Soviet lands, they began encountering scenes they never expected to see: all-female tank crews, female infantry units, female snipers, and most hauntingly, a regiment of night bombers composed entirely of women, whose presence brought a chilling fear each time night fell. In fact, the movement for women to learn how to fly had been growing in the Soviet Union for years before the war. Thousands of young women had joined aviation clubs across the country, developing both skills and passion for flying. However, despite their training and dedication, they were largely excluded from actual military operations, especially in the Air Force, which still clung to the belief that flying and combat were jobs for men only. A turning point came when two major factors converged. The first was the emergence of Marina Raskova, a legendary female pilot and navigator, often referred to as the Soviet Amelia Earhart. Known for setting multiple world records in long-distance flights, Raskova was not just a national hero, but an inspiration to tens of thousands of Soviet women. She received hundreds of letters from women all over the country, pleading with a single desire: let us fight from the sky. Raskova compiled all those heartfelt appeals, along with her own personal petition, and submitted them to Joseph Stalin, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. The second factor was a grim reality on the battlefield. Red Army casualties were soaring, and the Soviet Air Force had suffered heavy losses during the relentless German attacks. The military desperately needed more pilots, anyone who could fly without crashing. Faced with growing personnel shortages and rising patriotic fervor, Stalin finally relented, breaking the men-only rule in the Air Force and officially authorizing women to join the Red Army Air Force. By October 1941, thousands of women from all over the Soviet Union had signed up for service. While some were assigned to mixed-gender units, 3 entirely female regiments were established: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. These regiments weren't just made up entirely of female pilots, they also included ground engineers, mechanics, and logistics personnel, all of whom were women. Most of them were young university students, aged between 17 and 25, who put their studies on hold to serve their country. They received only a few short months of training, instead of the usual years, before being deployed to the front lines. Because the military had never prepared for the inclusion of female pilots, there were no proper uniforms available for women. As a result, these women had to wear old, oversized men's uniforms that didn't fit. Many of them had to stuff rags into their boots just to keep them from slipping off during operations. Among the 3 regiments, those with the highest skill level and full training were assigned to the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment. On the other hand, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, which carried out missions under the cover of darkness, was composed of women with less experience or minimal training. At the time, aerial combat was dominated by advanced, high-speed aircraft like the Supermarine Spitfire, P-51 Mustang, and the Messerschmitt Bf-109, sleek, powerful war machines equipped with the latest technology. But the 588th Regiment wasn't given anything even remotely modern. Instead, they were handed the Polikarpov Po-2, a wooden canvas biplane that looked like something out of World War I. To carry out their missions, the women of the 588th had to master the outdated Polikarpov Po-2, a vintage biplane built from canvas, wood, and wire, looking more like a relic flying over cratered battlefields than a machine of modern war. Originally designed in the late 1920s as a basic trainer aircraft, the Po-2 was also used in peacetime for crop dusting and flight instruction. The Po-2 was extremely small, with room for only 2 people, a pilot and a bombardier. It was slow and antiquated, with a top speed of only about 150 kilometers per hour, roughly 93 miles per hour, and a cruising speed around 110 kilometers per hour, 68 miles per hour. Its maximum altitude was limited to about 2,900 meters, 9,500 feet. Worst of all, the plane's entire frame was fragile and lacked any form of armor. If hit, the combination of wood and fabric made it highly flammable and prone to catching fire. Because of how flimsy and slow the aircraft was, pilots sarcastically nicknamed the Po-2 the coffin with wings. To make matters worse, parachutes were not issued to the 588 until 1944, meaning that for a significant portion of the war, if anything went wrong mid-air, they had no means of escape. Beyond its outdated design, the Po-2 also had limited offensive capabilities. Its maximum bomb load was just around 350 kilograms, under 800 pounds. In comparison, a modern ground attack aircraft of the same era, like the American P-47 Thunderbolt, could carry over 1,300 kilograms, nearly 3,000 pounds, of bombs, almost 4 times as much. To achieve a similar impact on the battlefield, Po-2 crews had to fly multiple missions per night, constantly risking their lives by re-entering enemy territory and facing intense anti-aircraft fire again and again. Their operating conditions were made even more extreme by the fact that the Po-2 was not equipped with a radio system, making communication between aircraft within the same squadron virtually impossible. Calling for backup or receiving navigation orders was out of the question, turning each mission into a solitary, information-starved, and highly dangerous endeavor. In such situations, the female pilots had to rely entirely on instinct, experience, and unbreakable camaraderie to survive. Yet it was within this adversity that they learned how to turn weaknesses into strategic advantages. The Po-2 didn't require a long runway to take off or land, which meant they could operate from open fields near the front lines, dramatically cutting down the time it took to reach their targets and increasing the number of sorties they could fly each night. In addition, the plane's very slow speed and low altitude flying capability made it surprisingly hard to detect or shoot down. In fact, in many cases, the Po-2 flew so slowly that German fighter planes in a dive fell faster than the Po-2 flew forward, making it incredibly difficult to lock on and fire accurately. Taking advantage of these peculiar traits, the female pilots of the 588th Regiment developed a bold and unconventional bombing tactic. Instead of flying in fast and retreating quickly after releasing their payload, the standard bombing protocol, they opted for stealth, surprise, and close-range engagement. Small squadrons of 3 Po-2s would patrol along the edges of German lines. Upon identifying a target, they would approach at extremely low altitudes, flying just above the treetops to avoid detection by radar or enemy spotters. Once they were close enough for the engine noise to be heard, the 3 planes would split apart, approaching the target from 3 different angles. This forced the Germans to divide their defenses, making it harder to anticipate the main attack and plunging them into a reactive, disorganized state. After splitting up, the pilots would shut off their engines and glide silently through the night, flying just over the treetops as they neared their targets undetected. Once in position, the bombardier would release the bombs with precision, often hitting targets within mere meters. Meanwhile, the pilot would attempt to restart the engine mid-air, a maneuver that was both technically difficult and incredibly risky, with the constant fear that the engine might not reignite. If successful, they would immediately accelerate and vanish into the darkness, leaving behind chaos and confusion among enemy ranks. As for the nickname Night Witches, there are several theories surrounding its origin. Some believe the eerie whistling sound of air passing through the fabric and wing wires of the Po-2 resembled the mythical whoosh of a witch's broom slicing through the night sky, strange, ghostly, and terrifying. Others suggest that it was German soldiers who, upon realizing they had been bombed by an all-female regiment, coined the term Nachtwechseln, night witches, as a mocking, misogynistic insult. Interestingly, the female pilots were not offended by the nickname. On the contrary, they wore it like a badge of honor, a symbol of boldness and courage. Over time, they began to proudly refer to themselves as the Night Witches, silent phantoms who descended from the skies each night to strike terror into the hearts of the invading forces. Eventually, the nickname was no longer exclusive to the 588th Regiment. It became a symbolic title for all Soviet female pilots, regardless of which unit they served in. In the eyes of their comrades, they were heroes. To the enemy, they were a living nightmare. From the night of their first mission on June 28, 1942, until the very end of the war, the Night Witches carried out 23,600 combat sorties, dropping over 26,000 incendiary bombs and approximately 3,000 tons of conventional explosives. Due to the limited payload of their aircraft and their proximity to the front lines, a single crew could fly up to 18 missions in one night, each lasting between 30 to 50 minutes, leaving no time for real rest or recovery. Their astonishing effectiveness sent shockwaves through the German ranks. Unable to believe that such relentless bombings came from an all-female unit, some German officers began spreading rumors that the pilots had been injected with special drugs that allowed them to see in the dark. Of course, this was nothing more than a desperate excuse for their humiliating defeats. In reality, the witches inflicted significant damage on enemy infrastructure and logistics. 9 railway lines destroyed, 2 major train stations demolished, 17 river bridges taken out, 12 fuel depots and 26 weapons warehouses obliterated, 11 searchlights eliminated, 18 fortified positions dismantled, and 176 armored vehicles knocked out of action. Among the 95 women awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor at the time, 23 came from the 588th Regiment, a number that stands as a clear testament to their unmatched bravery and extraordinary service. Despite their many triumphs, those achievements did not come without a cost. Throughout their time in operation, 32 courageous pilots from the 588th Regiment lost their lives, and 28 Po-2 aircraft were either shot down or went missing during perilous missions. Each fallen comrade was a part of the unit's lifeblood, a living testament to their unwavering heroism. So if we were to objectively evaluate the impact of the Night Witches Regiment, did they truly make a significant difference on the battlefield? From a purely tactical perspective, the physical damage they inflicted on the German military was relatively limited, mainly in the form of harassment and disruption. With only about 80 active personnel at any given time, they were just a drop in the ocean during World War II, a conflict that involved tens of millions of soldiers across the globe. However, their true power did not lie in the number of bombs dropped or targets destroyed, but in psychological warfare. Just the faint sound of wind rushing through fabric-covered wings, or a barely audible noise in the night, was enough to keep thousands of German soldiers awake, locked in a state of constant vigilance. And anyone who has ever suffered from prolonged sleep deprivation knows what that does to the mind: mental fatigue, heightened anxiety, slower reflexes, poor judgment. A dangerous state to be in, especially during combat. The invisible fear sown by these witches drove German troops into paranoia. They never knew when an attack would strike, from which direction, or whether that faint rustling sound was just the wind, or a sign of an impending bombing run. Some accounts even tell of German soldiers panicking at shadows, diving for cover even when no aircraft were present, simply because the psychological toll had become too much. That was the 588th's most terrifying weapon. A fear that had no form, no sound, yet never left. The mental impact these women had on the Nazi forces cannot be measured by statistics. But one thing is clear: they undermined enemy morale, shattered the illusion of safety, and disrupted the combat readiness of their opponents. And in the context of total war, that contribution was anything but minor. After the end of World War II, the Night Witches Regiment was officially disbanded in October 1945, marking the end of a heroic yet heartbreaking journey. But perhaps the bitterest irony came in a seemingly small but deeply symbolic moment. They were not allowed to participate in the victory parade on Red Square in Moscow, the grand celebration to honor the victorious Soviet forces. The reason? Their Po-2 aircraft were too slow, unable to keep up with the modern formations during the ceremonial flyover. It was a cruel and sorrowful ending. The women who had risked their lives night after night to defend their country's skies were quietly left out on the day of glory. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other fascinating stories.